Hello, my name is Carol. I'm 68 years old, and last week during a family dinner, my own daughter mocked me right there at the table. Why do you still dress like a peasant? She laughed, while her husband looked away, and my grandson fell silent. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. But what they didn't know was who I used to be, who I still am, and what happened next. It changed everything. Stay with me. You need to hear this. Mum, I send you money every month. Why do you insist on dressing like a peasant? Carol didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her faded cardigan and looked up at her daughter with a calm, unreadable gaze. Ashley was standing at the head of the table, her sleek black dress clinging to her with all the precision of her career, her makeup sharp, her tone sharper. The light above the glass dining table scattered across polished surfaces, crystal chrome glass. Cold reflections everywhere. The clinking of salad tongs against ceramic broke the silence. Carol's hand trembled slightly as she served herself. The sound stirred something, a memory of a dinner long ago in this same kitchen, when her late husband had built the cabinetry with his bare hands, when Ashley had laughed so freely as a child. That kitchen had smelled of rosemary and fresh dough. Now it smelled like lemon sanitizer and overcooked garlic. Ashley sighed. It's not just the sweater, Mum. It's everything. You live like you're still in the 80s. You could at least try. I'm comfortable, Carol said evenly. And I've always liked this cardigan. Your father gave it to me. Ashley rolled her eyes and took a sip of wine. Sentimental doesn't mean fashionable. Ryan, who had remained mostly silent through dinner, looked up from his phone. His fingers hovered over a message left unsent. Carol? He said politely. You wouldn't happen to know anything about semiconductor channeling issues, would you? Carol paused, setting her fork down. Do you mean instability caused by dopant diffusion during etching? Ryan blinked. Ashley frowned. If you're working with a compound structure, Carol continued, you need to balance acid A with catalyst B. Otherwise, unintended lattice defects compromise the conductive channel. She shrugged slightly. Basic materials theory. The table fell silent. Ashley opened her mouth, then closed it. Ryan's face shifted. Wait. That formula we just reviewed it this morning? Our lab's been stuck on that exact problem for 3 weeks. He pulled out his phone again, flipping through a document frantically. Your name, he said slowly. What's your full name? Carol tilted her head. Carol Hayes. Ryan's eyes widened. Dr. Carol Hayes. From the NASA Advanced Materials Division. Ashley's wine glass slipped in her hand, sloshing liquid onto the table. You never told me that. Carol reached for a napkin, dabbing the edge of the spill. You never asked. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't stiff. It was stunned. Evan, their 12-year-old son, had stopped eating. His eyes had never left his grandmother since the conversation began. Carol rose gently from her seat. Thank you for dinner, Ashley. I'll get going now. The buses get full after 7. You're not taking the bus, Ryan said, still half shocked. Let me. Carol held up a hand. I prefer it. Gives me time to think. She walked to the coat stand, reaching for her old wool jacket. No one moved. Money and status, she said quietly, can make life easier? Yes. But they can also make us forget who we are. I hope you never lose sight of that. She buttoned her coat with slow precision. No one spoke. Carol stepped toward the door. For a moment, the overhead lights caught on her shoulder, casting a soft shimmer across her cardigan. The old yarn seemed to glow faintly, as if finally seen. Carol didn't turn back. She walked out the front door, quiet, upright, untouched. Carol turned her back. The light from the glass chandelier reflected off her old cardigan like a faint halo. She wears that same cardigan every winter, like she doesn't want to let it go. Evan sat quietly at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the wool cardigan draped over the back of the chair. A single patch, barely visible, had been hand-stitched near the shoulder seam, the kind of repair no one would notice unless they looked carefully. But Evan noticed. The morning light slanted through the window, casting soft shadows on the wooden floor of Carol's apartment. It was a modest place, a second-floor unit overlooking a leafless row of trees, their bare branches clawing at the pale sky. A kettle hissed softly from the stovetop. Carol moved slowly, pouring water into 2 chipped mugs, one blue, one white. "Is that the same cardigan from last night?" Evan asked, not looking up. Carol chuckled gently. "It keeps me warm. That's all it needs to do." He traced the edge of the table with his finger. "It looks old, but kind of important." Carol didn't answer right away. She handed him the blue mug, steam curling upward between them. Before Evan could press further, the doorbell rang. Carol opened the door to reveal a petite woman with silver hair tied in a loose bun and a wool shawl around her shoulders. Diane. Her face lit up as soon as she saw Carol. "Still wearing that old thing, huh?" she teased, pointing to the cardigan. Carol grinned. "It's a classic." Diane stepped in, noticing Evan. "And who's this fine young man, my grandson Evan? He's staying with me this weekend?" Diane's eyes twinkled. "You know," she said, turning to Evan, "your grandmother used to wear that cardigan when she stood on stage to accept the Langley Materials Prize. What year was that, Carol, 93C?" Evan's eyebrows lifted. "Wait. Grandma, you won an award." Carol looked away, smiling softly. "It was a long time ago. People used to clap for very different things back then." Diane waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. She revolutionized the way we understood compound interface cohesion in extreme conditions, saved millions in research failures." Evan blinked. "What does that mean?" Carol gave a light laugh. "It means I got to play with atoms for a living." The room filled with an awkward warmth. Diane busied herself with taking off her gloves, while Carol tidied up a few papers on the nearby shelf. As she lifted a worn book, something thin and glossy slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Evan bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph slightly curled at the edges, its color fading. In the image, a younger Carol stood at an airport tarmac, windswept but proud, her hair tied back, and the familiar cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. Behind her was the unmistakable logo of NASA, partially blocked by the frame. She was surrounded by people in lab coats, clipboards in hand, the sky behind them wide and open. Evan stared at it. "You were there?" he asked. Carol glanced at the picture but said nothing. She folded it gently and slid it into her pocket. The conversation shifted to mundane things: Diane's arthritis, the neighbor's noisy dog, the way the winters seemed harsher than they used to. But Evan kept glancing at his grandmother. That evening, as he sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the trees, Evan couldn't stop thinking about that photo. Why would someone like her be hiding? "Sorry, Ma'am. Your name's not on the guest list." Carol blinked slowly at the young man holding a clipboard at the entrance of the grand ballroom. He looked barely 25, his suit crisp, his voice polite but unmoving. "I received the event email," she said gently. "I used to consult on this project." He offered an apologetic smile. "Yes, but this is the recognition ceremony for current contributors. If your name's not here, I'm afraid I can't let you in." "Company policy." Next to her, Evan shifted uncomfortably. He clutched the small envelope. Carol had brought the one that had the official logo embossed in gold, the one she had printed and reread 3 times. Carol looked at the clipboard again. The names were listed in elegant serif font, each followed by a department and title. She scanned the page twice. No haze. No mention. Behind the doors, light spilled from the ballroom into the polished marble corridor. Voices murmured inside laughter speeches, champagne flutes clinking in rhythm. A large TV was mounted just outside, looping a welcome video with names and faces. Ryan's face appeared for a brief moment, smiling stiffly, his name bold beneath it. Evan's jaw tightened. They invited you just to block you at the door? Carol touched his arm, stilling him. No need, darling. These things happen. Evan looked like he wanted to storm the ballroom, grab a microphone, and read her resume aloud. But he stayed where he was, breathing hard. Just then, across the hallway, Ryan emerged from a side corridor, adjusting his tie. He spotted them. He hesitated. Carol's eyes met his. He offered a tight, unreadable smile, then turned back toward the main hall without approaching. Carol didn't react. She turned toward the television, watching as the MC's voice crackled through the speakers. Tonight, we honor innovation, collaboration, and the brave ideas that brought us here. Slides clicked forward, diagrams, chip cross-sections, process iterations. And then one image caught Carol's breath. A schematic, simple but precise, with annotations written in blue ink, scanned onto the slide. She recognized the stroke of every letter. She had drawn that, years ago, on the back of a staff memo during a brainstorming session. Ryan's voice echoed faintly from inside. This configuration allowed us to bypass thermal drift and stabilize conductivity. Carol stared at the screen. Her cardigan felt suddenly heavier. Evan noticed. That's yours, isn't it? Carol's eyes didn't leave the monitor. It was, for a time. The young staffer at the door gave a sympathetic glance. There's a waiting area over there, Ma'am. If you want to sit. Carol nodded. Thank you. She and Evan took 2 empty chairs in the hallway's quiet alcove. Through the closed doors, applause broke out, muffled, distant. After a few minutes, Carol rose. Her hand gently touched Evan's shoulder as she leaned in. It's all right, she whispered. But it wasn't always theirs. That used to be her seat back when the room was full of voices. The wooden door chimed softly as Carol stepped inside the tea house. The scent of chamomile and bergamot floated gently through the warm air. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps it was her memory that had stretched the space wider, fuller, more alive. The place hadn't changed much since her university days. The same dark walnut tables, the gentle hum of soft jazz, and the faded mural of ivy vines curling along the ceiling beam. Only now the room was quieter, more composed, not quite somber, but tamed. She walked slowly to the corner table, her usual spot. Back then, it had been the loudest part of the room, laughter debates, clinking teacups, huddled shoulders over draft papers. She ran her hand along the grain of the tabletop, as though tracing something left behind. A young man in a crisp apron approached. Good afternoon, Ma'am. Here's our children's menu. Oh, sorry, wrong one, he stammered, switching out the colourful page with one printed on heavier parchment. You just reminded me of someone's grandmother who brings her grandkids here. Carol smiled. It happens. She ordered a cinnamon rose blend, the same drink she had once suggested, during one heated design session, long before it was listed on the menu. As she waited, her eyes wandered to the wall near the entrance. A framed photograph hung neatly surrounded by tea-themed quotes. It was a black and white image of a group of young engineers, wide smiles and clutched mugs in hand, seated at this very table. Carol's breath caught. She remembered that day, the celebration, after a grueling week of testing prototypes. But something felt off. She stood and walked toward the photo. Yes, there was Jeremy with his perpetual squint, Leah arms crossed and smirking. And in the center seat, the one she'd always taken, sat someone else entirely. A different young woman name, neatly labeled beneath. Carol scanned the caption. All the names were there, all except hers. For a moment she thought she had made a mistake. But the cardigan in the photo, the way one hand rested on a soldering notebook, it had once been hers. She had been replaced, or perhaps erased. She returned to her table. The tea had arrived. She sipped it slowly, letting the warmth soothe the growing hollowness beneath her ribs. Her mind drifted backward to a late evening in this same room. A meeting had been called after hours. The chip was failing at high temperatures. Everyone was frantic. She had taken a napkin and drawn the solution in less than 10 minutes. They had tested it that very night, and it had worked. But in the rush in her exhaustion, she'd told them to submit it without her name. Just fix it, she'd said. And they had. Now all that remained was a misattributed memory framed neatly on a wall. The same young server walked by again, not recognizing her from 10 minutes ago. "Enjoying your tea, miss?" he asked, cheerful. Carol placed her cup down and stood smoothing the front of her cardigan. "I think I've sat here long enough." "Ma'am, I can't find any result under that name." Evan stood behind the wooden reference desk, watching as the student assistant frowned at her screen. Her fingers hovered uncertain. "Are you sure you've spelled it right?" she asked, glancing back at him. "Carol Hayes." "Dr. Carol Hayes." Evan said again, firmer this time. The young woman shook her head, cheeks coloring slightly. "I'm sorry. Nothing comes up? Not in the archives, not in the technical journals? No dissertations, no patents under that name?" Evan stepped back. The ceiling of the old university library loomed high above its wooden beams, darkened with age. Rows of shelves stood like silent witnesses. The scent of paper and dust hung in the still air, broken only by the soft hum of scanning machines and the occasional rustle of pages. He turned to Diane, who stood quietly beside him, her hand wrapped around a worn leather folio. She didn't look surprised. "I thought she was published," Evan said. "She taught at NASA. She advised teams. Her name was on the original architecture for the quantum pipeline." Diane gave a sad smile and handed him the folio. "She was," she said softly, "until she wasn't." Evan opened the folio carefully. Inside were pages copied long ago, hand-drawn graphs, annotations in delicate cursive formulas that bent across margins. And at the bottom corner of each page, CH signed in blue ink. Why would she? Diane sat down at a nearby table. Ashley was 10. She had a sudden health scare. Carol dropped everything. She turned down a speaking tour in Japan, skipped the final phase of a research publication, and asked to have her name withdrawn. Evan frowned, flipping to a page with a circuit diagram he recognized. She withdrew it herself. Diane nodded. She said, "I can rebuild a design, but I can't rebuild a child." The words settled between them like dust on a window pane. Evan felt his throat tighten. "I thought my mom always exaggerated, said Grandma was just bitter." Diane smiled gently. "She wasn't bitter, Evan. She chose to fade. But that doesn't mean she disappeared." Evan glanced at the nearby monitor. His fingers hovered over the search bar again. On impulse, he typed in a phrase Diane had once mentioned. Quantum filtering with high-temperature modulation experimental notes. A single result appeared. Anonymous author. No citation trail. No institution. Just a digitized PDF file uploaded decades ago labeled cryptically. He clicked. The first page opened. The familiar graph greeted him. Then, on the last line of the footer, a single word, handwritten in scanned ink, Mom. Evan stared at the screen. His pulse slowed. They erased her, he murmured. But not entirely. She had piles of notes. None of them had her name. The attic was still and dim, lit only by a single shaft of light slicing through the slatted window. Dust floated like fine silk in the air. Evan coughed gently as he stepped over a forgotten suitcase and nudged open a storage box with a faded label, Old Projects. Private. Inside, yellowing pages sat neatly stacked, bound only by brittle rubber bands. Technical sketches, circuit diagrams, annotations scribbled in tight looping handwriting, some edges curled, others crisp. There were no titles, no authors, just a quiet forest of logic gates and component charts etched in blue ink. He sat cross-legged on the floor, hands trembling as he pulled one sheet out. Note: Catalyst X must be stabilized before heating or irreversible distortion may occur, it read. The handwriting was unmistakable. His fingers ran across the graphite strokes. The diagrams mirrored the ones he'd seen on Ryan's recent project presentation. The layout of the chip, the channel architecture, even the anomaly Ryan's team had struggled with for weeks. But here in this forgotten folder lay the answer, diagrammed and solved. Evan turned the page, and the next, and another. Dozens of schematics, each more complex than the last, yet strangely elegant minimalist, in a way that whispered confidence without the need for acknowledgement. Carol had drawn them. Evan didn't need a signature to know. In the bottom of the box, folded in half, was a printed email, faded to pale grey. It had been saved from an old dot matrix printer, the edges torn by hand. From internal anasa.com.tech, subject re-request to remove citation body. As requested by Dr. Hayes, her name has been removed from the final publication draft, confirming submission without authorship. Evan closed his eyes. The silence of the attic pressed in, filled only by the faint creak of wood under his weight. Why had she asked for removal? Why leave no trace? He looked around at the cobwebbed corners of the attic, this forgotten place where legacy lay, boxed up, not erased, but hidden. Not by force, by choice. Gently, he began laying the pages out beside him. He pulled out his phone and started photographing each one. Slowly, carefully, as though documenting something sacred. Each click of the shutter sounded like a promise. When he finished, he stacked the pages again, smoothing the corners. Then he took a small notebook from his backpack and wrote in clean block letters, Foundational Design Notes. Architect unknown, but origin certain. He hesitated, then underlined it once. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Evan walked quietly into Ryan's home office. He placed the neatly stacked folder on the desk. No note, no explanation. Just knowledge returned to its imitator. He turned off the light, closed the door softly behind him, and walked away. He left the documents on Ryan's desk, unmarked, unsigned. Did you check the stability numbers again? Something's still missing. The overhead lights in the Ford Tech conference room buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the oval table. Blueprints and diagrams sprawled across the polished surface. Screens flickered with circuit simulations. Outside the wide window, a grey sky pressed down on the city like a silent weight. Ryan leaned over the table, his fingers laced tightly, forehead creased. A senior engineer tapped at a keyboard, eyes squinting at error logs. Across the room, the director of Ford Tech rubbed his temples. "We can't launch with this error margin," he said. "The conductive pathways are collapsing under thermal load. We're looking at a complete recall if this goes live." Ryan exhaled sharply. "We ran the tests twice." "3 times," another engineer corrected. "And it still fails." "Your catalyst calibration is correct," Ryan snapped. We double-checked the chemical ratios. There was silence, thick and uneasy. In the corner, Evan sat quietly. He wasn't on the official team list, just a shadow today, a silent presence. His hands were tucked beneath the table, his eyes following every word. The door opened. A tech assistant stepped in and handed Ryan a folder. "Updated diagnostic, and one more thing. This was left on your desk this morning." Inside was a printout pages of circuit sketches, the same ones he'd glanced at last night. No name, no notes, just arrows, annotations, and a single underlined phrase, "Recheck the catalyst stability sequence." Ryan stared at it. One of the engineers leaned over, brow furrowing. "That looks like the old hand-drawn models from the 80s. Who made this?" Ryan looked at Evan. Evan didn't flinch. "Try the sequence." "Who gave you this?" the director asked. Evan paused. "Just test the model. If it doesn't work, toss it." Ryan hesitated but nodded. "Run the sim." Minutes later, the system blinked green. Stability achieved. Loss margin negligible. No one cheered. Relief came not with applause, but with stunned silence. Ryan stepped back from the screen, eyes scanning the sketch again. At the bottom corner, half-smudged, barely legible, were the initials CH. He looked up. Through the glass wall of the conference room, a figure was walking down the hallway. Grey hair, neat. A familiar cardigan. Slow, steady steps. Carol didn't stop. She didn't look in. But their eyes met. For a second, the world narrowed. No engineers, no data, no project. Just mother and son across years of silence. She turned the corner. Gone. Ryan stood still. The pages in his hand felt heavier now. Later, as the team packed up, he returned to his desk and pulled out his phone. He opened the image Evan had sent, a photo of handwritten notes, scanned with care. There again, in fine script, Carol H. His throat tightened. He whispered to himself, as if the room might answer, "How long have I been looking past her?" Ryan looked back at the photo Evan had sent, those soft initials in the corner. Carol H. She was meant to receive a medal. I wrote the speech. She never came. Diane's living room smelled faintly of time-old paper-dried lavender, and something like history paused. The wallpaper had yellowed in patches, corners peeling slightly. A stack of dusty magazines sat on a footstool, and behind her recliner stood a tall shelf weighed down with unopened books and folders labelled in faded ink. Evan followed Diane to a narrow cabinet tucked beside the window. She pulled open the lowest drawer. Inside were layers of carefully wrapped envelopes, embossed invitations, faded clippings, and at the very bottom, an ivory folder marked in blue pen speech. 1999 ceremony. I wrote this for her, Diane murmured, fingers trailing the edge. She was nominated for the National Medal of Engineering. It was a big deal, but she never showed up. Evan looked up, confused. Why not Diane's side, unfolding the typed pages? Her voice was soft. Ashley was hospitalized that same week. Carol didn't tell anyone, not even me. She declined the award, no explanation. I only found out months later. She handed him the speech. Evan took it slowly, sitting on the worn armrest of the couch. The paper was creased, but unblemished. It began with a simple greeting, then moved into quiet praise terms like trailblazer precision in silence and a mind that sought no spotlight. He read on. Then came the final paragraph words that felt like whispers from a wound. If I must choose between applause and presence, I choose to be there quietly. His throat tightened. A drop fell onto the paper. He hadn't realized he was crying. Diane sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. I was angry back then. I told her she was throwing everything away. But now, I think she chose with more courage than I ever had. Evan folded the speech hands, trembling. He looked around Diane's home, this quiet archive of moments, never spoken honours, never claimed. Do you mind if I make a copy? He asked. She nodded. Take it. Maybe it'll find the audience it was meant for. Outside, the air had cooled. Evan stepped into the street, the folder pressed against his chest. His steps felt heavier, more certain. The silence Carol had carried for decades was beginning to speak through others now. Evan left Diane's house carrying a copy of the speech, his voice steady in thought. It's time. It's just old paper, Mom. Why do you still keep all this junk? The basement smelled of dry cardboard and old summers. A bare bulb cast a weak yellow glow from above, swaying slightly as footsteps creaked on the stairs. Dust danced in the light. Concrete walls wrapped around shelves of storage boxes, each one labelled in Carol's careful handwriting. Ashley stood halfway down the staircase, arms crossed. Her heels clicked sharply on the bottom step as she spotted Evan kneeling beside an open box. He held a thin folder, scanning its contents. Schematic drawings, handwritten notes, numbers scrawled in margins, with the kind of urgency that comes from thought, not time. Ashley stepped forward, voice sharp. Evan, what do you think you're doing? Evan stood calm, but firm. Just looking. Grandma said I could. Carol was at the far side of the room, sorting through another stack. She didn't look up. Ashley's tone curled with disdain. These are just scraps. She's been hoarding this stuff for decades. Moth food and ink stains. Carol finally straightened, brushing dust from her sleeves. Her cardigan caught the light threadbare but intact. No, she said softly. They're parts of a life. Mine. Ashley scoffed. You act like someone's going to dig through this and find treasure. Carol met her gaze. No one has to. I remember. That's enough. The silence between them was weighty old arguments lingering beneath new ones. Ashley stepped toward Evan, reaching for his arm. We're leaving. Evan didn't move. Carol's eyes didn't leave her daughter. Let him stay. Ashley blinked. You're choosing him now. I'm choosing truth, Carol replied. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. Just then, Carol's cell phone rang on the wooden shelf nearby. Ryan's name flashed on the screen. She answered, her tone neutral. Hello, Ryan's voice crackled on the line. Mrs. Hayes. Carol. I need to confirm something. The chip layout we discussed, the hand-drawn one, is it yours? Carol looked down at the folder Evan had been holding. She took a breath. I confirm it, she said. But I don't need credit. I only want you to get it right. A beat of stunned quiet passed. Ryan thanked her, his voice faltering before the call ended. Ashley stared, unsure what had just shifted, but something had. Carol walked to another stack, pulled out a thick file. As she opened it, several loose papers fell to the floor. One photograph fluttered out face up. Ashley bent to pick it up. It was a picture of her age 5 sitting cross-legged in Carol's old office. Crayons scattered a stuffed bear in her lap. Behind her on the desk were blueprints. The same diagrams Ryan had just described. Ashley held the photo, her fingers trembling slightly. Ashley stood before the boxes, staring down into them, and saw a photo of herself as a child, tucked among chip diagrams and faded ink. There's a seat reserved for a special contributor. But no one showed up. Spotlights scanned across the room like soft white fingers, brushing over glossy suits and sleek dresses, illuminating every row of the grand hall at Ford Tech. The front row gleamed brighter than the rest, its center seat marked with a gold placard, Dr. Carol Hayes, Honorary Advisor. It was the kind of title that made heads turn. But the chair remained empty. Backstage, just 30 minutes earlier, Carol had stood before a mirror, smoothing the front of her modest dress. The cardigan, ever present, had been freshly pressed. Evan had offered to drive her, but she'd politely declined. She needed to arrive on her own terms. Then her phone had rung. It was Ashley. "Mom? Don't come." Carol's hand froze mid-button. Ashley's voice was tight. "Please, I know they sent you an invite, but if you show up in that cardigan, if the press sees you like that, do you understand what this will do to me?" Carol said nothing at first. Ashley went on. "It's just not the right time." After a breath, Carol simply replied, "All right." She ended the call, picked up her purse, and left the house anyway. At the entrance of the Ford Auditorium, she was greeted by a young receptionist until Ashley appeared, replacing the girl in one smooth motion. They didn't speak. Ashley gave a faint smile and gently took the VIP badge from the receptionist's hand. Then, discreetly, she walked toward the front row, lifted the reserved seat placard, and tucked it into a drawer behind the reception desk. Carol watched the entire scene. She nodded once lips curled in the faintest knowing smile. Without a word, she turned and walked away, cardigan sleeves brushing lightly against her hands. Inside, the lights dimmed. The event began. Ryan stepped onto the stage with a stiff confidence. Behind him, a massive screen projected the prototype chip, its circuitry gleaming like a map of tiny cities. He walked the audience through its capabilities, its breakthroughs, its elegant chemical stability. Then, without meaning to, he said it. The breakthrough came when we applied the Hayes catalyst sequence. He paused. The room did too. Murmurs rippled through the front rows. A few heads tilted toward the empty chair. Ryan's eyes flicked to it. His throat tightened. The ceremony continued. Applause came in measured waves. But the golden glow from that vacant seat never dimmed. An anonymous email landed in the Ford director's inbox. "She never asked for credit. But truth deserves daylight. I found an old tape. She never raised her voice, but I couldn't stop listening. The cassette was small, unmarked, its edges worn from time." Diane held it in her palm like a relic, her fingers trembling just slightly. "I didn't think it still worked," she murmured. Found it tucked behind the recipe books. Evan gently took it from her, eyeing the dust-covered player she had set up in the corner of her living room. The wooden floor creaked as he moved, and the faint ticking of a clock on the wall filled the silence between them. He slid the cassette into the machine and pressed play. A low hiss broke the stillness, then voices distant, faded by age, yet distinct. "This is the Systems Fault Analysis Meeting, July 2002. Subject doping instability in layered channels." Then her voice. Carol. Measured. Calm. Commanding without force. "If the thermal resistance rises above 0.4, we introduce acid A diluted to X. But without the stabilizing catalyst, you'll trigger side reactions in layer 3B. That's why you must adjust the electron flow early." Evan leaned forward. The sound crackled, but her clarity cut through. Someone on the recording asked, "Why don't you file for credit, Carol?" She paused. Then her response, Not everything brilliant needs a spotlight. Some things just need to work. Diane looked over at Evan. He didn't blink. She was always like that, Diane whispered. Even when they begged her to step forward, a new voice from the tape mail curious. Do you regret not taking the award? There was a pause long enough to hear a chair shift someone breathing. Then Carol answered quietly, I'd rather miss a medal than miss her first dance recital. Evan inhaled slowly. Applause echoed from the tape, small but real like a wave of private respect, then static. He hit stop. Silence returned, thick with meaning. Diane cleared her throat. It's not much, but it's proof. Evan didn't move. His eyes were wet, jaw tight. He stared at the player for a long time, then finally turned to her. People need to hear this, not just us. Evan looked at Diane. People need to hear this, not just us. You used to admire her. Now you erase her with every word. The living room glowed with soft, curated light. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected the afternoon sun onto polished hardwood. A family portrait hung above the fireplace. Ashley, Ryan, and Evan captured mid-laugh in coordinated navy blues. Carol was nowhere in sight. Ashley stood by the sideboard arranging coffee cups that no one had touched. Her movements were precise, as if the ritual might anchor her. Carol sat quietly on the far couch. The sunlight hit her cardigan just so, lighting its frayed edges in gold. Evan positioned a small portable speaker on the table. Before we talk, he said gently, there's something you should hear. Ashley's mouth opened to object, but the recording had already begun. The same tape. Carol's voice unwavering. If the thermal resistance rises above 0.4, we introduce acid A diluted to X. Ryan, seated near the fireplace, leaned forward, elbows on knees. Ashley turned slowly, her face tight. Where did you get this? Evan didn't answer. The tape continued. Without the stabilizing catalyst, you'll trigger side reactions in layer 3B. A younger man's voice from the recording. Why don't you file for credit? Then Carol, softly, not everything brilliant needs a spotlight. Some things just need to work. Ashley stood frozen. Ryan's gaze flicked between his wife and Carol. He didn't speak. When the final lines played Carol's quiet answer about the dance recital, a silence fell over the room, heavier than any argument could carry. Carol turned to her daughter. Tell me, Ashley, what do you hear in that voice? Ashley looked away, jaw clenched. Her fingers gripped the back of a dining chair. Evan stepped back, giving space. Carol didn't press. She simply sat, still waiting. Ashley's voice broke. I thought you left your work because you weren't good enough. Because they didn't choose you. Her eyes began to brim. You were already chosen, she whispered. And you chose me. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could wipe it away. Carol nodded once, then said with gentleness, No. It's because I believed one day you'd be strong enough to realize it yourself. Ashley crumbled into the chair. No one spoke. Outside the window, wind brushed against the tall glass, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. Carol, no. It's because I believed one day you'd be strong enough to realize it yourself. She hasn't sat here in days. The chair stays clean, unused. The porch looked the same, at least at first. The paint on the railings still peeled in thin flakes. The same creaking board on the third step still protested when Evans stepped onto it. The wind moved through the apple tree with a sound like someone gently rustling an old quilt. But the chair was different. It was clean, too clean. No imprint in the cushion, no folded blanket, no half-read book on the side table. Just the silence of absence. Evan stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, the collar upturned against the creeping chill of late autumn. He turned the key and entered the house. Inside, the stillness deepened. The hallway smelled of lavender and dust. On the kitchen table lay a single envelope propped up by a ceramic apple, the kind Carol always said was too pretty to eat from. His name, in her looping cursive. He opened it slowly. Dear Evan, I'm staying with Diane for a little while. Not far. I just think this house needs time to be quiet, and I might too. You don't need to worry. If anything, this silence is a kind one. I've never asked anyone to remember me. I only ever hoped that what was true wouldn't be forgotten. Shot's grandma. The words were not heavy, not sad. They settled into his chest like freshly fallen snowlight, but unmistakable. He sat down on the stool by the window and looked out across the backyard. The apple tree stood bare now, its leaves curled in drifts near the roots. A memory nudged at the edge of his mind, him barely tall enough to reach the lowest branch, holding a pair of gardening shears too big for his hands. Carol's voice beside him, steady. Don't cut too much. The tree knows how to grow. You're just helping it choose where. The front door opened. Diane's coat brought a small chill with her as she stepped inside, carrying something soft in both hands. She started this last week, she said, holding up a half-finished scarf, light grey wool still attached to its knitting needles. Said she wanted to leave something in the middle of being made. Said it suited the season. Evan took it gently. The pattern was simple. Clean rows of pearl and knit. A thread loose near the top, caught on one of the needles like a breath held in. She okay? He asked quietly. Diane nodded. She's fine. Just giving space. For everyone. He walked to the porch again, scarf in hand. The wind had quieted. Evan looked at the chair, then slowly unfolded the blanket still draped over the backrest. He placed the scarf gently across the seat and stood for a long while watching the sun stretch out its golden fingers toward the tree. The house behind him said nothing, but it didn't need to. The porch light came on automatically as evening settled in. Evan hadn't noticed how long he'd been standing there until the glow fell across the scarf, casting a soft gold hue over the unfinished wool. He stepped back inside, closing the screen door gently behind him. He wasn't sure what to do next. There was no plan, no conversation to replay. Just the echo of Carol's absence, an absence that felt more like a decision than a disappearance. He wandered into the living room. The lamp near the old bookshelf was on a timer. It flicked on right at 6. Beneath it sat a basket of folded linens, and on top, another envelope. This one had no name. He opened it anyway. Inside was a letter dated just a few days earlier. This house remembers more than it forgets. The table still has a notch from when you spilled juice at age 5. The back door still sticks when it rains. And the stairs creak in the same places they always have. I've loved being the keeper of its memories. But now I think it's time for you to decide what stays and what goes. See. He smiled, bittersweet. On impulse, he went to the old drawer near the front hall. The same one Carol used to keep stamps and old birthday cards in. He rummaged until he found the faded address book tucked between expired coupons and loose change. He flipped to I for Institute. The number was still there. He didn't hesitate. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered a clipped professional tone on the other end. This is Dr. Lambert's office. Yes, hi, Evan said. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Carol Hayes. She received a letter about some kind of recognition. A pause. We sent a request last week. We'd like to formally honor her contributions to early-stage catalyst mapping in semiconductor design. We weren't aware she was still reachable. Evan breathed in. She is, but she won't call you herself. A longer pause this time. Would she be willing to accept the award? I don't know, Evan said. But I think she'd accept if the truth came with it. He left his number and hung up. Then, without thinking, he stepped outside again. The air was sharper now. He walked past the porch down the stone path toward the apple tree. He remembered standing here years ago when Carol had handed him a small pruning knife and said, "Choose carefully. Once it's gone, it doesn't grow back the same way." The tree still stood. It hadn't bloomed this year, too tired maybe, but its branches stretched out wide like open arms. Evan sat on the grass beneath it, knees pulled up, hands clasped. This wasn't just about awards, or credit, or even justice. It was about space. Carol had left, not out of anger, but to give space for the truth to settle, to echo, to ripple outward. Just then the mailbox creaked. He stood and walked back up the path. Inside the box was a crisp envelope, white and embossed. To Dr. Carol Hayes. The Institute for Advanced Technical Recognition formally requests your presence. He held it against his chest. The scarf on the chair fluttered in a breeze that came and went like a breath. And the house, still and silent, seemed for the first time at peace. These walls are full of faces, but none of them are hers. Ashley stood in the hallway, arms crossed, staring at the photo collage she'd curated over the years. Smiles framed in gold and silver glass, polished every moment, frozen birthdays, graduations, vacations. Yet as her eyes moved from frame to frame, something hollow tugged at her chest. Carol was nowhere to be seen. A soft chime pulled her attention to the floor. One of the smaller frames had tipped, sliding off its hook and landing on the wooden boards with a gentle clack. She picked it up, brushing off the dust from the corner. The backing had loosened, and behind the polished print was a faded, older photo, one she hadn't known was there. It was of her as a toddler, bundled in a knitted scarf, arms wrapped tightly around Carol's neck. Carol's cardigan was visible, the same one she always wore, her expression soft and present, not distant. Ashley stared at the photo, something tightening in her throat. In the kitchen, Ryan sat silently stirring a cup of tea. He had no intention of drinking. Ashley placed the photo on the counter face down and opened her laptop. A new message had arrived. From Evan's subject. Thought you should hear this. There was no text, just a file. She clicked play. Carol's voice filled the room. Calm, steady, articulate. This misalignment in the sequencing isn't random. It's a direct response to the catalyst instability. If left uncorrected, the chip's entire substrate could fail under sustained thermal stress. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Ashley sat down. She remembered that voice once so familiar in the background of her childhood. She remembered waking from a fever as a girl, the faint scent of ginger porridge lingering in the air. A warm hand had rested on her forehead just for a moment. Then silence. When she called out, no one had answered. Carol had already gone. Ashley stood walking back to the hallway. Her fingers trailed the frames. She opened the cabinet below and pulled out the old photo albums, the ones Carol had once kept. The pages had yellowed slightly, the plastic film curling at the edges. As she flipped through a pattern, emerged photos, clipped cut at angles, margins cropped too tightly. Carol was there once, but piece by piece she'd been trimmed away. In the final album, tucked behind a recipe for cinnamon bread, Ashley found a Polaroid. She and Evan at the science fair, holding ribbons. Carol's hands rested on their shoulders, cropped halfway out of frame. But her shadow still lingered. Ashley returned to her desk and opened a new email. To Mom, Carol. Hey, yes. Subject? No subject. She stared at the blank space for a while before her fingers began to type. Mom, if you still read these, I think I finally heard you. She hovered over the send button, then clicked. A quiet release followed, not dramatic, just the settling of something long disturbed. Miles away, Carol sat by a window where light filtered through lace curtains. She reached for her tablet, eyes narrowing as she opened the new message. No attachments, except for one small image. Ashley, as a child, wrapped in the same cardigan, smiling. Carol didn't respond. She simply opened the photo, gazed at it for a long time, and let a quiet smile form, not triumphant, not resentful. Just full of something old, returning quietly, like footsteps once thought lost. It's not a movement. It's just a table. And some women. And their stories. The room was modest, just a square box within the city library, tucked behind shelves of forgotten manuals and microfiche cabinets. Afternoon light spilled through the window, catching dust in soft halos. A circle of wooden chairs stood around two library tables pushed together. Nothing grand. No stage. No microphones. Carol walked in first, holding a soft leather-bound notebook and a small tin of peppermint tea. Diane followed with her usual canvas bag filled with scarves, pens, and a thermos of something steaming. Behind them, in slow and scattered steps, came the others. There was June, a retired pediatrician with arthritis in her fingers, but still a spark in her eyes. Beside her sat Harriet, whose son hadn't spoken to her in 4 years, and Linda, a former science teacher who once wrote curriculum guides for schools that never credited her name. All of them wore neutral tones, coats over sweaters, quiet like winter earth. Carol didn't make a speech. She placed the notebook in the center of the table. Write what you know, she said simply. What you saw. What you did. What mattered, even if no one noticed. There was a pause. Then a shared look. Then June reached for the pen. Her hand shook, but the ink held. One by one, the others followed. No introductions, no credentials. Just hands moving slowly across paper. Diane smiled faintly. We should call this the silent record. Evan arrived just past 3 carrying a small audio recorder and a packet of spare batteries. He didn't interrupt. He set the device at the table's edge and pressed the red button. A soft click. The whir of memory in motion. No one posed. No one read aloud. The room filled with the sounds of pages turning, of pencils scratching and pausing, of the occasional breath catching in the throat. Stories began to layer themselves, fragments of lives lived fully but acknowledged quietly. Carol didn't write at first. She sat with her hands folded, watching the curve of June's letters, the hesitation in Harriet's hand. Then, without a word, she reached into her coat pocket and took out a pen. She turned to the first blank page of the notebook, its spine still stiff. In small, precise strokes, she wrote, I did not come to demand justice. I came so someone else might not have to live as quietly as I did. The pen paused after the last word, then lifted. She closed the notebook, not sealing the thought, just giving it a moment to rest. Outside the glass door, a shape appeared. Ashley. She didn't knock. She didn't enter. She placed a soft brown parcel on the floor, leaned it gently against the wall, and left. After a few more pages had been filled, Carol stood and walked over. She picked up the package and returned to her chair. Inside was the cardigan, her cardigan. Mended, washed, folded with deliberate care. The edges no longer frayed, the neckline stitched back with matching thread. Carol didn't cry. She didn't unfold it. She simply placed it across the back of her chair, smoothed it once with her palm, and returned to the table. Stories continued in ink and breath. No fanfare, no ceremony, just beginnings. They don't stand to protest. They sit and speak. And somehow, that's louder. The soft rustle of the newspaper filled the room as sunlight crept gently across the wooden floor of Carol's living room. Her cardigan, now neatly folded, rested on the armrest of the chair by the window, no longer a garment of burden, but an emblem of something reclaimed and redefined. Carol turned the page slowly, her eyes resting on a modest article tucked near the bottom. Weekly Women's Circle gathers in silence. A photo, blurred slightly by poor lighting, showed the edge of a wooden table. Around it sat older women, some hunched, others upright, their hands resting on pages or one another. No quotes, no names, just a caption, no recordings, no interruptions, just space to be. Outside, the neighborhood still wore its early hush. Evan's voice broke it gently as he appeared at the doorway with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a small silver hard drive in his hand. "I wanted to bring this before I go," he said, offering it to her. Carol raised an eyebrow, amused. "I thought students traveled lighter these days." Evan grinned. "It's not for me. It's a copy of the recordings. All the sessions. I thought maybe you'd want them. To archive the unheard." Carol turned the hard drive in her palm, weighing it not by grams, but by memory. She didn't say "thank you not" in words, but her eyes softened as she placed it gently on the windowsill beside the morning paper. "There are things we don't need to store," she said after a moment. "Some things just need to live inside someone. That's enough." They stood in silence. Through the window, the apple tree in the front yard was beginning to bud again, stubborn against the lingering chill. "I never said this, but—" Evan hesitated. "You didn't just teach me science, Grandma. You taught me silence." Carol looked at him, touched by the truth in his eyes. "Then you learned the hardest part." He nodded and hugged her. It wasn't a long hug, just enough. After he left, Carol stayed standing for a while. The quiet was no longer empty. It was full of what had been said, what had been heard, and most importantly, what had been understood. She walked over to a bookshelf that had long stood untouched. From one of its top drawers, she took down a dusty family photo album. Gently, she placed a new photograph into an empty slot, a copy of the picture Ashley had emailed weeks ago, this time untouched, untrimmed. Beside it, she slid in a candid photo from one of the story circles, a group of women seated around a table, their heads bowed in writing or tilted in listening. A single chair was visible at the end, her own, the only one empty because she had stood to take the picture. Then she returned to the window where her favorite chair waited. The cushion had faded, but it was firm, and the view, unchanging yet always different, remained her quiet companion. As she sat down, her gaze rested on the front path. A figure approached slowly, a woman of similar age, bundled in a coat that had seen many winters. She paused at the gate, hesitant. Knock. Knock. Carol smiled as she took the woman's coat and gestured toward the inner room. The walls still held no plaques, no certificates, only the warm hush of women mid-sentence, some finishing a thought, others lost in quiet reflection. The woman placed her hands on the wooden table, smoothing the surface as if reading the stories stored in its grain. "I haven't spoken in years. About the work. About what we built," she said softly. "No one's asking for a speech," Carol replied. "Just your truth, as much as you're willing." She slid a plain notepad across the table. No logo, no header, just a lined invitation. The woman nodded. Her pen moved slowly at first, then steadier. Around her others murmured names, milestones, injustices, long-swallowed lessons almost lost. No one interrupted. They let each voice settle like silt in water until the room glowed with stillness. From her seat near the window, Carol could hear the click of Diane's knitting needles, the rhythm familiar and grounding. A cardigan, half finished, rested on Diane's lap, purple soft. Not meant for warmth, but for presence. Evan returned just before noon. He stepped inside, quietly, recording device in hand, eyes scanning the room until they met Carol's. He mouthed, "Thank you." She simply nodded. Later, over tea, he asked, "Do you think any of this will matter in 50 years?" Carol stirred her cup. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether someone still listens." Evan looked around at the women writing, remembering, reclaiming. "I'll listen." Carol reached for the old photo frame Evan had once repaired. She placed it gently on a low shelf beside another image. Ashley had recently mailed a candid of her daughter in a lab coat holding a circuit board looking up. For the first time, Carol allowed them both to be seen side by side. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Another woman, grey hair pulled back tightly, stood at the door. "I heard there's a seat." "There is?" Carol said, rising. "There always is." The woman stepped in. Evan clicked on the recorder. Not to preserve, but to witness. Outside, dusk painted gold across the porch, and the old apple tree, its branches bare, but not dead. Carol sat. The table filled again, not with guests, but with voices. Not loud, not urgent, but insistent in their truth. And the machine, almost forgotten, still ran. Its red light blinked, still recording. The room no longer needed applause, only the quiet, steady voices of those who had once been silenced. Carol never demanded recognition, but in choosing truth over revenge, she reclaimed something far more enduring: dignity. Justice may not always arrive with fanfare, but when it comes, it stands like morning light through old windows, undeniable, soft, and absolute. Sometimes it takes just one woman sitting down for generations of silence to finally stand up. What did this story stir in you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because some truths deserve to be spoken. Like this story, follow Grandma Stories to never miss a tale that echoes long after it ends.